Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today we are going to talk about the movie Fast Color, starring Gugu Mbatha-Raw and Lorraine Toussaint, as well as Sanaya Sidney. Fast Color has a sci-fi dystopian feel to it, and I found this movie on Amazon Prime. I'm in the US, so if you are as well, then you may want to check it out. So this movie takes place in the near future, as far as I can tell, when water is a very scarce resource. It has gotten to the point in which we're still using the American dollar as currency, so it's not quite like dirt in Waterworld or anything like that, but it is very scarce. There's no longer running water. And if you go to a hotel, when you go to the front desk and you pay for your room, they also will ask you if you want a full portion or a half portion. And when they say that, they mean it in terms of water, at which point they will give you a jug that is either partly full or completely full, and you have to pour it out yourself for bathing or brushing your teeth, or drinking it, etc., cleaning wounds even. It appears that in this future, it just doesn't rain so much anymore, but that it's a relatively recent occurrence in the time of our main character, Ruth's life. And Ruth is played by Gugu Mbatha-Raw. So when we start out in this story, we see Ruth having escaped from a warehouse, and she is fleeing in the dark of night. She's going across the desert, she's trying to hitch a ride with passing cars, and there are people looking for her. It seems that people from the government are tracking her down and somehow finding her wherever she is. So this setting is kind of a wasteland, not quite to the degree that you would see in The Walking Dead, and there are no zombies. It's just folks have left areas that don't really have solid access to water, or reliable or enough access to water. So they are out looking for more resources, which is similar to what you would expect in a zombie apocalypse. Because remember, a zombie apocalypse is not just about avoiding zombies and other humans, it is also about acquiring resources, as other stores that we once relied upon are also no longer open as a consequence of that dystopian setting. It has a very American West feel to it, which I really enjoyed. It's really sparsely populated, and you have a lot of roadside bars and diners that you see as being the only things that are truly still open, aside from a motel here or there. But it appears that people don't frequent these motels, and many of them have actually just been abandoned. So as Ruth is fleeing across the desert, we see that she's also having seizures. And when she has a seizure, it causes an earthquake. The first time we really get to see this is early on in the movie, After Ruth has ran away from that warehouse, she ends up at a motel where a woman and her very small daughter are the only people working there. And you can tell that they haven't had many guests in a while either. So Ruth is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place in running from the government, but she is also shown to be a very kind-hearted person. When she sees the little girl and she pays for her half portion of water, she tells the lady essentially to keep the change and nods towards the child, and the lady thanks her. So when Ruth goes into her motel room, she starts having shaking hands. And at first I thought that perhaps she was going to go into some kind of psychological state and write all over the walls or something as she began taking down pictures or paintings from the walls and unplugging any electronics that were in there, as well as removing the mirror from the wall. But she just lays all of these things down and then straps herself onto a bed after she had washed her wrists. So we could see that she had been tied up somewhere before and her wrists were very bloody, and now she's trying to hold herself down again. But instead of writing anything, which I thought was going to happen because of the specific way her hand was shaking, but that doesn't happen here. Instead, Ruth goes ahead and calls the front desk and tells the lady for her and her daughter to get underneath the front desk. And when this first happened as well, I thought that perhaps she had somebody who was coming after her who had some kind of powers, who were going to be there to harm them. So I thought that maybe she had some kind of precognitive powers, and that there was also something coming that was going to harm them specifically. But nope. Turns out that the problem is Ruth herself, but she's not bad and she's not in control of these earthquakes. So she shakes apart a lot of the building and a lot of what's on the walls in the other areas too. There's nothing she can do about it though. It's very clearly a seizure. It's not even that she just can't control her power, but it's that her power is almost like a byproduct of these seizures. So as soon as she is done with the seizure, she goes ahead and climbs out the back window because it's alerted the local authorities. And that also means that the government probably knows where she is too. In that manner, it feels like they're kind of tracking her through seismology and perhaps through seismographs. We don't really go into much detail regarding the force or duration of Ruth's particular earthquakes, but a seismograph would tell them that. So in that way, they seem to kind of be following Ruth in a manner that is very reminiscent of hunting down the graboids in Tremors. They're kind of treating her like some type of a monster. And so Ruth is just running for her life. And that's really the first dichotomy that we see between Ruth and these others, the government. So there aren't that many characters in this movie, actually, and I really like that. One of my favorite psychological thrillers is Hard Candy, in which you're not quite sure until the end what is exactly going on. And this movie, Fast Color, also leaves a lot of space for confusion and for the reader to see things unfold as it goes along, just like the actual folks who are experiencing it. I meant viewer, not reader, but you guys know what I mean. So I like that about this movie. Y'all know how I feel about exposition. And some people might argue that this takes it a little bit far, and so we might be confused for a little bit longer than normal. But it didn't stop me from watching the movie in any way. I just made assumptions and then went, oh, okay, I'm not right about that. It's actually this. which I honestly enjoy. I think that a lot of movies nowadays are so predictable that it can really suck a lot of the fun and imagination and surprise out of the films. But this movie actually did keep me guessing. It's not necessarily meant to be a psychological thriller, and the pacing isn't anything like that. But it does do a great job in telling a story that I did not necessarily expect. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what happens after Ruth leaves this hotel. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were introducing the movie Fast Color and where we are in this dystopian sci-fi world, with our character Ruth, played by Gugu Mbatha-Raw, who is running away from the government because she has seizures that result in earthquakes in a world in which it doesn't rain that much anymore. And so her powers could perhaps have an environmental impact, and that is most likely why they're after her. So after she has the seizure in the motel, she goes ahead and leaves. She flees through a window before they can get there and track her down. So after she leaves, she goes to a local diner. Remember, diners and dive bars are really the only things that seem to truly be open with any reliability. And when she gets there, she has a breakfast, and she didn't get a coffee because coffees are made with water, and so they're expensive. So she's just eating an egg, and every time someone comes through the door behind her, she kind of turns and looks. So a gentleman who's sitting near her asks if she's expecting anyone. And you can tell she does not want to talk, but he engages her anyway and goes ahead and buys her a cup of coffee, which is kind of a gross trick that I've seen people do to other people in order to make the recipient feel that they are now somehow owing the other person of their time. I don't like it, and it made me uncomfortable immediately, as I believe I was meant to feel uncomfortable as a woman. So when he does this, she does answer a couple of his questions, but she keeps it very brief. He's like, "Where are you going? Where are you from?" And she's just like, "Around." Like, she's not caving. Like, "I'll talk to you about the coffee, but I am not telling you about me as a person," is the sense that she really gives you. And she does not owe him anything. So as they sit there, they talk for a little bit, and then he finishes his food and heads out. And she's just about finished by that time as well. So after a few moments, she also leaves. But as she does, she sees that there is a cop outside at the car that she had stolen to get there, following her escape from the warehouse. And the cop is looking at the stolen plates and taking down the information for it. And all she can do is just freeze in the moment with her hand on her backpack. But that's when the man who was in the diner yells out for her, "Oh, hey honey, I'm over here," and gives her an out, which she takes. So she barely knows this person, but she doesn't know anyone else around here, and she goes ahead and gets in the car with him. And they go down the road. And as they go along the road, he's still trying to force the conversation. And she lets him know, hey, thanks, but you can really just let me out anywhere now. Just let me out. It's fine. You don't owe me anything, and I don't need to continue having this conversation, more or less. I'm being in this car with you. And she's not in panic mode or anything. She just does not want to really talk to this man, to the point that she's willing to just be let out in the middle of a cornfield. You get the sense that Ruth has been on her own long enough that she's not really daunted by any of these other conditions. The other problems that she faces are much more serious in comparison to having to walk through this cornfield. And so the man keeps talking to her, though, and doesn't really go to let her out until he pulls over and tells her that he is actually a government agent and he has been following her. And he's like, who do you think called the cops? So it's a very gross and violating moment for Ruth from a person that she barely even knows. She really doesn't know this man. We don't know how long they've been driving down the road by this time, but it clearly hasn't been very long, and she's immediately very disturbed. This is, in fact, who she was running from, and so she tries to get out, but she can't unlock the door and get out of the car. So he tells her that he wants her to just chill out because he's going to inject her with some stuff to help her calm down and take her back to the lab, and that, they've been looking for her. So Ruth pulls out a gun from her bag, and she manages to shoot him in, I believe, the arm one time, and then she also has the gun and is fighting with him when the gun goes off and blows out the window. So she's able to get herself out of the window before he can inject her with whatever that substance is within the syringe. But she leaves behind everything else that she had with her, including that backpack, and just runs across this empty field to get as far away from him as quickly as she possibly can. And it's at this point in the story that we get a shift in perspective. We see a different setting. So we see a little girl named Lila and an older lady named Bo. And Lila has just fixed the record player in the living room. And she tells Bo in the kitchen that she's fixed it and asks if maybe the next thing that she works on can be the truck that's outside. So you get a sense that this girl is very gifted with tinkering with different mechanics. She's really skilled at fixing things that are broken using her hands. And it almost seems to be like a supernatural skill in a way. It gives you kind of Anakin Skywalker vibes, to be honest. And I really liked that concept. But we find later that that's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily what is happening. Although we also don't find that that is entirely not to be true. But that's not necessarily the way that the powers manifest, is what I'm trying to get at. So she is very proud, Bo is, of this little girl, and the girl asks if she can have some water to go take a bath, and Bo tells her, you had a bath yesterday. And she's like, well, I just wanted another one. But water is so scarce that this is like a luxury for folks in this area. Folks in possibly the entire United States, or maybe the entire world. We're not sure outside of this American West setting as to really how far it pervades, because it's not relevant to our story. So the little girl then asks for a cup of water and asks Bo for more in order to brush her teeth too, and they agree that that's enough in the cup to do both. And you can tell that this is a conversation that they've had many times, but it's a conversation had with fondness. And so the little girl goes upstairs to get ready for bed and everything. And Bo goes and checks the record player, and sure enough, the girl has fixed it. Lila has fixed the record player. and she'd recently fixed a toaster too. And when Lila had said she'd fixed it, she said that this time, this one was a lot easier than the toaster. And Bo said to her, "It wasn't easier than the toaster. You just got better." And I think that that's a very important way to frame it. And it's the difference between a talent and a skill. You hone a skill. You might have a predisposition towards a natural talent, but practicing it is what is really giving you those skills so that you can develop them. And that's kind of what Bo is saying and setting this apart. So there are powers at work here that we'll see here in just a moment with Bo, but that's not necessarily the powers that Lila is exhibiting when she's fixing these things. This is more of a skill rather than anything else. In addition to being a powered family, Lila is also just a very skilled person when it comes to tinkering with things and making repairs. The child is gifted, but she's also brilliant. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss Bo's powers and what happens when she meets with Ruth. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing Lila and Bo's interactions and being introduced to these two characters, and also discussing how we find Ruth interacting with this government agent and ending up on the run again. The government agent is technically a scientist, but he is operating in a government capacity. So I think it's really both, or it's interchangeable in that way. But after Lila goes to bed, Bo goes and checks the record player and sees it does indeed work, and she starts listening to Nina Simone and goes outside to smoke a cigarette. As she's smoking the cigarette, you see her disintegrate the entire cigarette, and the material that it's made of starts floating around in the air, and it's very beautiful. And that's the point when Ruth makes herself known, that she's standing there and watching them. And she's been standing there watching for a while. But Bo is not necessarily super stoked to see her, and Ruth tells her that she shouldn't be smoking. So Bo reintegrates, I suppose, the cigarette back into being a cigarette, and it's still lit and smoking at that point, even though it had been in the form of tiny little particles before. But she makes it just go right back to her mouth and continues smoking her cigarette. We find that Lila is Ruth's daughter, and Bo, who is Ruth's mother, has been raising her because Ruth had been very wild as a youth. And they really take the time to develop the backstory for this movie, just like they develop the ongoing narrative too. So we have space for some confusion and a lot of questions as we go along. But I like that. We don't have this expositional filler of characters just explaining to each other why they are the way they are and going on these monologues or diatribes. A lot of it is told with the spaces of the silence and just with anger and the expressions on people's faces. But this interaction in seeing the cigarette disintegrate and reintegrate is really our first true clue that Ruth's seizures might not just be a power that's unique to her, but it may be something that is inherited. It's something that is genetic in nature. I had suspected something similar with Lila, but I was also wrong in that manner because I thought that her mechanical gifts were a result of this type of genetic heritability. But we see that Ruth is not the only one who has powers. Also, her mother does. Lila just barely knows her mom and doesn't really seem to recognize her when they do meet. But I do like to think that even though they don't acknowledge the mechanical mind of Lila as being a gift, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not. And I think that Ruth also thinks that Lila's gift may be related to mechanics too. We see that at a different point in the story. But you can tell that Bo is not really stoked to see Ruth. She is concerned about Lila. And we find as the story unfolds that Ruth was addicted to drugs for a long time and perhaps also alcohol. She uses different terminology as the story goes on, at one point referring to it as being sober for 11 months by the time she is meeting Bo back at this house. So I'm not entirely sure what precisely she was using, which substances, but it doesn't really matter for the story. We get the point that she is a recovering addict and that is part of what Bo is concerned about, is how wild Ruth had been the last time Bo had seen her and how that could really negatively impact Lila. But we also find that Ruth's seizures are another component about why Bo is worrying about Lila. We see that they're really also hiding out there. Ruth asks if the nearest neighbor is still so-and-so a few miles away, and Bo lets her know that those people moved a while back. There was no real access to water, and so they just up and left. So they don't have any nearby neighbors now. And Ruth is relieved to hear that because of her seizures. And her mom asks her if she needs any salve or if she needs to tie her down for the seizures, and says that tying her down was always the most hurtful part of having to witness that with her child. But Ruth is also mad at her mother in some ways, and they're mad at each other. So Ruth ends up just being very upset with her and going to sleep in the barn by herself in the bed that her mom had set up for her. And Ruth's mom, Bo, goes back into the house. That night, though, Ruth does have more seizures, and we find that after she stopped drinking, the seizures actually got worse. After she became clean and or sober, she got worse with her seizures. And now sometimes she even has up to 2 per night. So the frequency has increased. Lila definitely feels the seizure earthquakes during the night and gets really freaked out because all of these pictures and stuff fall to the ground within the home. And they go out to the barn to meet with Ruth. And Lila just kind of stares at her. She doesn't really know who she is. And we really get that underlined when Bo says, "Lila, this is your mother." We also learned that Lila's powers are kind of underdeveloped, and it's a little bit wild. Everyone is very tense in this situation, and they don't really end up talking until the following morning at breakfast, from what we can see. So the 3 of them are eating cereal or oatmeal or something around the breakfast table. And Ruth points out that the bowl that Lila's using was hers and says that it broke at one point, and Ruth tried to use her powers to put them back together, but unfortunately their powers can only take things apart and put them back the way that they were, in the state that they were when they initially, disintegrated it. It's not disintegrating into nothing, but it's breaking down into much smaller parts, almost like sand being blown in the wind is kind of what it looks like. And she and Lila kind of finish the sentence together, and it tells you that this is something that at least Bo has told them, if not other ancestors down the years. This is something that is very specifically phrased. And that ultimately Ruth had ended up just hot gluing the bowl back together because her powers only enabled her to disintegrate it and put it back into those separate pieces that it was already broken into when she decided to repair it. So we learn a lot in this interaction about the specific powers. We are going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk some more about the powers and about this family. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Ruth, Lila, and Bo all meeting together for the first time and starting to have conversations around the table. It is fraught with tension, and you can tell that Ruth is normally really frayed around the edges and along her nerves when she's on her own, and now she's in another stressful situation and being reunited with this family. But this movie isn't really so much about the powers. It ends up being mostly about the family. And we spend a large portion of the movie just seeing them go about their business, just being on the farm and working on the things that are important to them. So we find that Ruth used to have these powers that Lila and Bo have of being able to disintegrate things, and we see Lila demonstrate it for us too. But when it happens, Ruth tells them that, or rather tells Lila, Bo already knows this, that she used to have these powers, but then she started doing some things that she shouldn't have been doing. She phrases it as being sick and tells her, it's not that kind of sick, but stops short of telling her that she was an addict. But she explains that she used to have powers and that she began having seizures instead with these earthquakes at a certain point. And while she was on this special medication, being the substances she was using, then she was able to not really have these seizures. And she knew that when she quit, that they might come back, but she didn't think it was going to get worse. But now she has them a lot and it's worse, but her powers have never come back. Amidst all of this happening, we see a lot of flashbacks with Ruth, and you see a lot of water flowing, and it seems to very much upset her, but you're not entirely sure what these flashes totally are. You just know that they're memories or perhaps premonitions. So she's scared of something. We're just not entirely sure what. but it looks like a room that is filled with water, which is very strange because we're currently in a world that barely has any water. We get to see the family going through their daily routines, though, communicating with their body language in the silence as much as they do with their words. And you can tell that Ruth herself still seems a little wild. She's scared of hurting people with her seizures, but she knows she can't do anything about them. So she still sleeps in the barn at night while Lila and Bo still sleep in the house. It's a very beautiful setting. It almost reminds you of an old painting. And we also find as the story progresses that Ruth has kind of been holding out on information with Bo and Lila. She hasn't been wholly forthright as time has gone on. She just let them know that she came to see them, she wanted to be back, and that she wasn't safe in other places. And that makes Bo uncomfortable because that puts Lila at risk. But she doesn't really tell them about the man that she fought off in the car who wanted to take her back to the government facility. She doesn't tell them about leaving the government facility to begin with, or that the government is still searching for her and that they're able to track her via her earthquakes. So it's really upsetting to especially Bo as time goes on and these little details that are truly big details of monumental importance, especially to Lila's safety, kind of come out a little bit at a time. Meanwhile, Lila just continues to work on the truck, and a lot of that is almost background music to many other scenes. They're both very proud of her and what she's able to accomplish, but they're not entirely sure if she's going to be able to get the truck up and running. They're still encouraging, though. But she needs some tools for it, so they go into town, and when they do, they run into some men from the government, including the guy that Ruth had shot earlier in the story. And they see the little girl and decide that she is the spitting image of Ruth, and that Ruth is very likely in that town. So they start looking for Ruth, because she's gone to town with Bo just to get some tools to work on the truck. So unfortunately, they don't know it yet, but Ruth has already been outed, more or less, as being in this town. The actresses do a fantastic job. You really see the strength of Bo just as much as you feel it, and you can see that same wild thread in Ruth and Lila, too. Lila admits to Ruth partway through the movie that the reason she wants to fix the truck is so that it can be hers and she can leave. Lila wants to leave this small life that she's been living, but she seems even younger than Ruth was when Ruth seemed to have driven away. Lila, to me, comes across as being about 11 or 12, probably. I'm not entirely sure, though. I don't think it was stated. But she's very young to be leaving home and driving around, from what I could tell. Ruth doesn't necessarily enjoy hearing this from her daughter. It makes her very scared, and she cracks down on Ruth a little bit. She doesn't tell Bo that Lila had told her she wanted to leave, but she does get upset with her and mandates that it's now bedtime. Meanwhile, throughout this story, Ruth has decided that she would like to try to learn to regain her powers, and so she's been practicing. Somehow, though, a window breaks. We don't see anything hit it. There's nothing in the room to indicate that, but Ruth was attempting to use her powers when it broke. So she goes upstairs with Lila, and she tells Lila that she thinks that Lila can fix it, and tries to get her to envision fixing it. And so all the glass pieces come up together into the air, and they fit together like puzzle pieces with their constituent parts. And it looks like there is some kind of magical glue. Like, it's not goopy like glue in that manner, but I mean that there is some almost orangey and sparkling force that looks like it's knitting these back together. And Lila gets pretty far with it, and Ruth thinks that she's truly going to be able to get it back together when it all comes crumbling back apart to the ground. And Lila gets really upset and tells her, "See, I told you it wouldn't work." And it seems to be just something that Lila has accepted, that their powers can't really fix anything. And I think that that also gives her a sense of helplessness. And in that way, almost a sense of learned helplessness. Ruth was raised to believe the same thing, that their powers could not heal anything or put anything back together. Yet she still believed that Lila might be able to go ahead and do that. But Lila doesn't believe in herself, and that may have just as much to do with her not being able to repair the window as this prophecy, or not really a prophecy, this rule that's been passed down through generations in the family, that their powers can't be used to fix things that are broken. However, Lila does have a very mechanical gift. And so Ruth seems to think that her talent and her skill with mechanics might really mean that for her, she is able to heal things and put things back together. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up the plot line of this story and then talk about some of the resulting themes. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how these characters are really exploring what they're capable of and trying to regain control over their lives, or to gain initial control over their lives. Lila wants to leave the farm because she wants to have some sort of feeling of control over her life and doesn't want to live this small life anymore. And that's something that Ruth had previously done. And that's how Lila has come about. Ruth had a wild youth. And when she did, with her sneaking out and everything, she ended up getting in with the wrong crowd and becoming pregnant. And at a certain time in the story, goes ahead and tells Lila that she was so strung out that she did not even know who Lila's father was. So we see that Ruth's anger is a result of her being scared that her child is going to repeat those same mistakes. It is anger through a fear reaction. And I mean, Yoda said it, you guys. Fear leads to anger. And he's right. And we see that happening here. Ruth, meanwhile, is trying to regain the control over her life. She has been sober for at least 11 months. So she's regained control over that portion of her life. And she's made the conscious decision that she would rather have these seizures than be strung out all of the time. So in that way, you can see that she's really taking a hold of her life. She's confronting her problems, and she's now also trying to regain her powers. That is part of it. She's getting back in touch with her roots and with her family. She thought that she had to run away in order to experience life and be happy, but now she finds some solace in this quiet life, even as it's wholly necessary for her to be there in order to be safe. We also see that Bo has a book that the women in their ancestry line have been writing in for years, and that their family has lived on that farm for years in order to be safe, that the women have these powers and that they often end up living there, just the women, and trying to protect their female children from the dangers of the world around them that would seek to harm them because of their powers. We also learn that the women can see these beautiful colors, like after images, after they've finished disintegrating and reintegrating these materials, whether that be a bowl or a cigarette or anything, a chair, a door, a wrench. It doesn't really matter. If it has matter, then they can go ahead and disintegrate it and reintegrate it, as far as I can tell. And so we find that there's a lot of generational cycles going on here. It's not just Ruth who has ran off and her daughter trying to repeat her cycle in a way. Bo did the same thing. She used to sneak out of the house and walk to town and meet a boy who turns out to be the sheriff of the town currently. And she would go out and meet him, and they would do that every day. They would go to the candy store in town for almost a year, every Saturday for almost a year before her mom found out. And then her mom really put her in lockdown in the house, and she had to stay there for a long time. But then her mom gradually grew more comfortable, and Bo started sneaking out in the middle of the night to go and meet him. He would call and wait for 5 seconds on the answering machine with leaving dead air, and then she would know to meet him at what looked to be like a ball field or something that night. And so this happens in the story too. While Bo and Lila are out picking up supplies to fix the truck, they get a phone call, but nobody says anything on the answering machine. And Ruth mentions that to Bo when she gets home, and Bo listens to it and realizes it's him. So she goes into town, and that's where she really finds out how much trouble Ruth is really in, that the government is tracking her down, and that they have tracked her down to this town of Garrison. We also realize that this is Lila's father, and he seems to have a lot of love for Bo too. They seem to still be very fond of each other, but have decided that it's safest, even though they love each other, to stay apart to keep Ruth and Lila safe. That's what the women and their family have done for generations. So there's also Bo's generational cycle of pain and overprotectiveness that she inherited from her mother, and then she bared down too hard on Ruth, and so then Ruth rebelled. And similarly, Lila also feels like she is in a cage, and she wants to take the truck and go out into the world and see what's out there. And Ruth likewise reacts with anger out of fear for her child, and ends up mandating bedtime and just totally changing the mood and the tone of their interaction that night. We also learn that just as Ruth went out into the world and then became pregnant and came back home, so had Bo with Ruth. And that's why they're acting in this manner towards each other, why there's this latent pain and resentment and fear. It is a generational cycle, truly. And we're going to talk a little bit more about generational cycles here in a minute. But first, let's go ahead and wrap up this film. We do see that this movie is not really about the superhero component. It is a feature, but it's mostly about the women, and it's mostly about their power and their creativity. This movie has a quiet strength, just like the women in it do. It's very quiet as it's illustrating all of these points to us. It's not hitting us over the head with their powers or emphasizing those really to any large degree. It's about Ruth taking back control of her life. That's why she wants to get her powers back. It's not because of the powers themselves. She just wants to not have these seizures anymore and be on the run and put her child and her mom in danger by the government coming after her. She's trying to reseize power and control over her life. It's also about the creativity. It's not only the ability to take things apart and put them back together, but also the ability to see the colors, how absolutely beautiful they look as this after image. And Bo tells her that Lila's still fascinated by the colors, and she asks her, well, aren't you? And Bo says, well, no, I've been doing this for over 50 years. It's not the same for me anymore. She's still little and it's still new for her. But we do know that Bo still enjoys using her powers. She says that she and Lila's powers are closer to parlor tricks and not anywhere near as powerful as Ruth's had been. But Ruth can't really remember her powers being super powerful anyway. And she doesn't really seem to remember the colors either. Once the sheriff does let them know, though, that the folks are coming after them, he comes out to the farm, and Bo is like, what are you doing here? Visibly in a panic, because she feels that his very presence is threatening to them. And he tells them, hey, those guys are going to come out here. You need to go. Like, Ruth, you need to go right now. And Lila is like, who is this man? And Ruth's like, this is your grandfather. And she clearly holds some resentment towards him too. So Ruth decides to leave. She decides that's definitely the best thing for Lila. This is when she snaps on her and tells her that she was so strung out she didn't know who Lila's father was, and that the world out there is not what Lila thinks it is, and she doesn't need to be out there doing that. And then she takes the keys to the truck that Lila had fixed that used to belong to Ruth, but Ruth had given to Lila, and she goes to get out of town. And when she does this, there's not a lot of gas in that truck, and so she runs out of gas and pulls a gas tank out of the back of her truck, a little gas container, I suppose, and goes to fill it up by walking to a gas station nearby. And as she's there, she starts having those flashbacks again about the water filling up, and you see her hands start shaking while she's filling up the gasoline. And it almost seems as though the flow of the gasoline may be triggering her in a way that the flow of water may have before when she was cleaning her wounds. We're not entirely sure if it does trigger it, but in that sense it does feel almost like a PTSD event, and that this sense of flowing liquids may be triggering her. So when this happens, she tries to get as far away as possible from the gas station, because that's very dangerous. And she runs and runs while she's having these flashbacks and ends up being flung onto the ground because she doesn't have control over her body anymore. And when that happens, we get to relive the entire memory. And we find that when she was a young woman and had come back to her mother's house, she was playing on the bed with Lila and had then fallen asleep. And sometime in the middle of the night, these pipes broke and the water just flooded the house. And Lila had gone under the water and had almost died. And she is very traumatized by that. But we also now see that really she is reclaiming who she is, and she's healing her trauma and those past experiences. And she can remember her baby's face now. And now that she's able to do that, she can see the colors again. And the sky opens up and it starts raining. The hair on my arms is standing up right now, you guys. Just remembering this scene. It's so beautiful. And she goes back to her family as fast as she can, only to find that the house has been tossed and they're not there. So she goes to her father's house, and who says that Bo's on the way, but that those men took Lila. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up the film and finish discussing these themes. Stay tuned.
The the Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing how Ruth is finally able to see the colors again as she starts dealing with healing some of her generational trauma and choosing, instead of to run, to go back and reclaim her life, only to find that her daughter has been taken by the government and that her mother is on her way to her father's house right then. So when they're all standing there together, Ruth explains that she was broken for a very long time and that she couldn't even remember her daughter's face. And that may be partly because of the addiction that she faced in an allegorical way. And it's part addiction and part PTSD and part these generational cycles of seemingly poverty and freaking out on your kids because you're scared for them and how the world is going to treat them just based off of who they are and this genetic component of their lives, much like people of color are afraid for their children every day because of how racist will react to them. But she tells Bo that she remembered her daughter's face then and that she can see the colors again and that she has her powers back. So they go together with Ruth's father to town to where Lila is being held. And it just turns into a very self-sacrificing moment in which Ruth opens up the sky and pours rain down to get the guys to come outside. And they want to go ahead and take her with them. But Bo tells them no, that Ruth and Lila are both babies and that their powers are slight and underdeveloped. And you find out that Bo's also been downplaying her power this entire time out of a sense of wanting to protect the others. And that's just something that the matriarchs of the family have done for generations. And so she says, my powers are stronger. I've been doing this for longer. I will go with you, but you will let them go and you will leave them alone. And as she's saying this, she's also disintegrating the doors behind which Lila is being held. Lila had tried to disintegrate the doors for herself earlier, but wasn't able to do it. But Bo could. And then Bo disintegrates the other door that's standing between them. And Lila comes out and hugs her grandma, who gives her this small piece of paper and tells her to give it to her mom and lets her know that she's not going with her. It's really beautiful, and you can see how broken-hearted all of the characters are watching Bo make this choice, including the man who is Ruth's father. He is also very sad, and you can tell he still loves her very much, even if they've been at a distance this whole time. He really loves her, and he has since they were kids, but they were just kept apart by this genetic component of her life that would have made it dangerous to her and to the girls to be together. But Bo isn't sad in any way. She is resolute. She is strength personified and is not afraid of them at all. She disintegrates all of their guns all at once. We have multiple men with guns drawn on them, like somewhere between 4 and 7. And she just easily disintegrates all of them. And goes on into the building, and she's like, you're going to leave them alone. Come along. And she very strongly walks into the building, and as she walks in there, she reintegrates the door behind her. So they can still open it and everything, but it's pretty hilarious. And it gets the point across of, I'm not worried about you. You can't really do anything to me. I have all the cards right now. I will help you fix this weather issue that we're facing, but you guys are gonna leave them alone. You're not harming anyone else in my family or in my lineage. These cycles of generational trauma end with me. So this movie is about matriarchy. It's about climate change in a minor way. And it's also about generational trauma. But really, it's mostly about matriarchy and generational trauma. And climate change is just the sci-fi dystopia vehicle through which we get to tell this story. I absolutely love that. I love that this isn't really focused on the science itself, that it is focused on these characters. It's such a beautiful way to tell a family story, and putting it in a sci-fi setting is right up my alley. It's kind of like how Santa Clarita Diet isn't really about zombies. It's about family, and this family navigating these new dynamics between each other as the daughter is growing up, even as the mom is also experiencing this huge change. So I love sci-fi settings and speculative fiction settings in general, horror, etc., that are truly about family. And that is what Fast Color does a really great job of conveying. Now, some of the story does seem to be spread a little thin in some areas, but that's because the focus isn't on the sci-fi components. And if you view it as a family movie that is set in a sci-fi dystopian context, then it's a very different movie than looking at it as a sci-fi movie that is also about family. They're two very different contexts. And the focus here is on the matriarchy and these generational traumas. It's a very intimate movie in that way, and you feel like you really know these people. You care about what's going to happen to them. You wonder if the dad is going to play a role in their lives now that it's safe because of the sacrifice of their matriarch, Bo. Many families have these generational cycles in which these things just seem to repeat each generation, whether that be becoming pregnant early or this reaction of fear turning into one of anger that is then resulting in being overprotective towards your children, which then makes them feel isolated, that makes them want to leave just as you did, and it results in rebellion. It's a positive feedback cycle, and in that way, it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy, even as it is a generational cycle. They crack down on you because they're trying to make sure that you break that cycle. But by doing that, they make the very same mistakes that their parents made and reinforce it for you. And it's not just these social interactions either. It's also psychological. The types of anxieties and fears are the same as they're passed down. It can be financial. Poverty can also be a generational cycle. And it can also be biological. So the study of epigenetics is the study of genes being turned on or off, more or less. It doesn't change the sequence of your DNA, it just changes its structure by doing things like inserting a methyl group into a certain base pair, or by going in there and modifying the histones so that the genes can be read by loosening them up or by tightening it so the genes can't be read. So it's just whether or not they can be translated or read that's changed by these different modifications. But the DNA itself isn't changing. And this normally happens in reaction to your environment. And they found some very strong associations between PTSD and epigenetic changes. So you can have certain types of stress responses that result in specific genes turning off your ability to produce glucocorticoid receptors for your cells. And that leaves you unable to truly react in a healthy manner to stress. You're going to feel it more. You're not going to be able to deal with it the same as someone else. PTSD has often been associated in studies with DNA methylation in particular. And methylation just kind of puts a little methyl group on there as a cap so that the gene can't be expressed. It's still there, you just can't see it. Several studies also suggest that this type of trauma that happens in one family or one generation can be passed on to others in an inherited manner, that these epigenetic changes may be visited down through generations. So someone who is exposed to a great trauma and is a survivor of that trauma and then goes on to reproduce may end up passing those genes along to their offspring and their offspring's offspring. And these epigenetic changes can impact not just your mental health and your emotional health and wellness and your social wellness, but also your physical health. You can end up with a lot of different problems that range from the psychological, as changes in DNA methylation can increase your risk of developing stress-related psychiatric disorders in adulthood. It's also been related to cancer development and has been really illuminating in twin studies in particular, where you can control for the genetics and then see the epigenetics. You can see how the environment has really made an impact on the body. And it sounds like science fiction, but we're finding more and more that this seems to be true. And they're studying this in non-human animals as well. Things like subjecting mice to an electric shock when paired with the smell of cherries until the mice become afraid of the smell of cherries. They get anxiety at the smell. And then they don't do this to any other mice, but they have these initial mice reproduce, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, the F1 and F2 generations, are also afraid of the smell of cherries. They get very anxious anytime that smell is around, even though they've never been exposed to that in their environment. And they believe that it's being passed down epigenetically via a stress response. So trauma can be transgenerationally transmitted via epigenetics, and it can impact your health. It can also impact your psychological behavior. So chastising your children before they've done anything wrong because you're afraid that they're going to be in harm's way based on your previous experiences, or just constantly being in fear that they're going to end up with the same outcome that you had. And that constant stress is also not good for you. There's also a generational transfer where a child who has been fussed at a lot and has been overprotected, like we see with Ruth in this situation, grows up to be a mother who develops that same fear-based behavior that was demonstrated by her mother, and then visits that upon her daughter, who then in turn makes this third generational same choice of trying to make the same mistake that her parents did, and her parents before her. It can vastly reshape who we are as individuals and who we are as communities. This is something that's very indicative of the fact that racism is very pervasive when it comes to how it impacts individuals of color, how entire peoples of color can be impacted transgenerationally as these epigenetic changes accumulate in response to these stressors. Remember that in response to certain stressors, you can actually end up with your genes turning off your glucocorticoid receptors and thereby making it harder for you to react a certain way to stress. And that's really what Fast Color seems to be about, at least in my understanding of the film. That's what I got from it. It's about how these generational cycles tend to repeat until one of us or more of us choose healing and find a way to heal from it and to not perpetuate the cycle. Bo decides that the best way for her to protect her family is no longer to hide, because she sees how that is resulting in these generational cycles of trauma and how it's impacting the girls. And she decides, no more. I am going to do this instead. We're not hiding anymore. You are going to be safe. And this is the best way that I can ensure it. We're going to go ahead and move forward here. And Ruth decides to go ahead and take her life back under her own power and to regain her ability to see these colors, to see the beauty in life, and to have true control over her life and be able to just love her daughter for who she is, instead of lashing out at her in fear of whom she may become. This is a very beautiful, matriarchal and generational trauma related movie. And if you have generational trauma in your family, whether you think that's epigenetic or psychological or behavioral and so on in nature, I think it's a really good movie to watch. Everyone, I think, has their own stuff going on in their families, whether that be being excessively aggressive or being completely avoidant or anywhere in between. We learn these behaviors and we can pass them on. But the great thing about epigenetics is that because it's influenced by our environment, we have the power to make certain changes regarding our environment and our reactions to them as we go along. As Viktor Frankl says, if you can no longer change your circumstances, you are challenged to change yourself. That's not to say that you can undo all of these cycles of generational trauma all in one single generation, or that you have to do it all yourself, or that it should be on you to do it all yourself. Doing that is very hard, and I think that it probably requires a lot of continual growth. Personally, for me and my family's generational cycles, I'm trying to break them, and it's partly down to choices that I make every day as I choose kindness and choose to remain calm rather than reacting. I can't control what happens to me in my life, but I can control how I react, and perhaps in that way break through some of these generational cycles and really find some healing in my family, like we see with Bo and Ruth and Lila in Fast Color. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.